All right, so this is a very brief overview of the Jamestown colony, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the Mid Atlantic colonies, which technically Virginia is not a part of. So I'll discuss in a future lecture. So Jamestown is really the first successful English colony in the New World, located in Virginia, close to the Chesapeake Bay. It's chartered by James I in 1606, chartered to the Virginia Company. In just a second, I'll talk about the distinction between a chartered colony and a royal colony, because there's a lot of distinctions between them. Virginia and Jamestown in general struggles for the first several years. There are, of course, woefully disproportionate expectations about what the settlers are going to encounter when they get to the New World compared to what they actually encounter. There is, by and large, an expectation, some of which is based off of rumors that are flooding in from Spain, that the settlers are going to be able to essentially get off the boats, load the boats with gold that's just kind of sitting on the edge of the water, get back on the boats and sail back to England. Of course, that's not possible. Gold is not a resource that's particularly abundant on the East Coast, and certainly not in the Chesapeake Bay region. So the settlers that come to make a part of Jamestown, they go through a rough time, really between 1607 and 1610. That's also the time that John Smith is present. I'll talk about him a little bit more in a second. He's kind of an interesting character in English and early American history. Between the winter of 1609 and 1610, the colonists in the Jamestown settlement are essentially decimated. They go from 300 to maybe in the upper 60s in terms of settlers who survive what's called the starving time. They starve essentially, by the way, because they're surrounded by Powhatan Indians. The Native Americans turn on the settlers after a period of peace and prosperity for reasons that are kind of obvious, because they're not treated very well by the new settlers. And perhaps we would do the same when faced with a certain opportunity. And so without support of the indigenous populations, the people of Jamestown go through what's called the starving time. But as difficult as it may be, they do survive it. By 1614 and 1615 and 1616, the Jamestown colony starts for the first time to turn a profit, and that is because of particularly one man, John Rolfe, who introduces tobacco into the Jamestown colony. Tobacco is an excellent resource for the Chesapeake Bay. It grows in abundance and becomes the principal export that make the Virginia colony viable. That being said, Virginia does not exist as a charter colony very long, becoming a crown colony in 1624. I'll talk in much more detail in future slides about the arrival of the first African slaves in North America in 1619. A little bit about the difference between a charter and a royal colony, because there's two essential types of colonies in the New World for England. In a charter colony, the King of England grants the use of a given space. In the case of Virginia, this is extremely open-ended because they don't really know where anything is in the New World, in exchange for monetary compensation. So you're a company, you basically buy the right to establish a colony, you're going to govern it yourself, and you reap the proceeds. But this can also crucially be revoked by the crown. This is going to be places like Virginia, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, so on and so forth. Massachusetts, it's probably the most successful charter colony. For just a moment, let's compare that to a royal colony. So a royal colony is under crown control. It's a colony administered by royal officials on behalf of the crown. So the buck stops with the King of England. In a charter colony, the buck stops with the individuals who have purchased the charter. New York is the quintessential royal colony that we'll see in the beginning. At the end of the colonial period, most colonies have transitioned to essentially royal colony status. The most important people in terms of the foundation of Jamestown, so the first successful English colony in the New World is John Smith and John Rolfe. John Smith is the biggest self-promoter in the history of the English colonies. His number one person is John Smith. If you read any of his reports on the New World, you come away with it with the impression that thank God for John Smith because he saved everyone. And that's the impression that he wants you to have. After spending multiple years in the Ottoman Empire as a slave, John Smith comes to the New World and does a fairly effective job of organizing the new colonists into groups. He's sort of famous for the "he who shall not work shall not eat" policy in Jamestown, which proves to be effective until a mishap, quote unquote, with a cannon ends up laying him low and he has to return to England. He gets there just before the starving time. John Smith gets a lot of the popular imagination and credit for the establishment of Jamestown, but it's really John Rolfe who makes Jamestown a viable colony. And as I mentioned before, the way he does that is tobacco. Tobacco is an extremely lucrative cash crop. It's a cash crop, which means it doesn't feed the local population. You don't grow it for sustenance. You grow it in order to be able to trade it on the open market. The only problem is going into the 17th century, Spain essentially has a monopoly on tobacco, which is a New World crop. It's new to the Europeans. And Spain is extremely rigorous in its protection of tobacco. They don't let anybody have the seeds. They don't let anybody have the plants, so on and so forth. How John Rolfe got those tobacco seeds remains even a bit of a mystery today. It doesn't matter because he got them. And by establishing tobacco plants in Jamestown, he turned it and then ultimately Virginia into a viable colony for the export of tobacco. He is the person, by the way, not John Smith, who ultimately marries Pocahontas, which is the Indian princess, I suppose, of lore and legend. Pocahontas isn't her actual name. It's somewhat of a nickname. She certainly didn't marry John Smith. John Smith claims that she saved him. There's some dispute about that, but she would have been about 12 years old at that time. She's not a lot older when she marries John Rolfe, by the way. She's probably 16 or 17. Sadly, Pocahontas dies in England before John Rolfe's return voyage to Virginia. So I want to wrap up today by talking really fast about the middle colonies, of which Virginia is not a part, but I want to talk about the southern colonies in the beginnings of the institution of chattel slavery in detail in future episodes. So for this one, I just kind of want to focus on the middle and, yeah, let's face it, kind of forgotten colonies. The Pilgrims and then slavery kind of get all the attention. New York is established first as a Dutch colony. Henry Hudson does all the exploration, hence the Hudson River. He's going to die in a mutiny, but that's going to be some years off. By 1664, New York is ceded to England, as well as what's going to be New York City, established on Manhattan. It starts as New Amsterdam, but they change it. As I mentioned previously, it's established as a royal colony, not a charter colony. New Jersey, also similar, starts out as a Dutch colony, but by 1664, becomes an English colony. New York and New Jersey kind of have a love-hate relationship that lasts all the way to 1738 when they finally stop sharing a governor and New Jersey gets a government of its own. Pennsylvania is kind of an interesting colony. I talked in the previous lecture about the 3 Gs, the 3 reasons that new people from Europe would colonize the Americas: gold, glory, and God. Pennsylvania is the God version. In 1681, Charles II granted Pennsylvania to William Penn for a debt of 16,000 pounds, which is amazing. It's an incredibly small amount of money today. And the reason that he did this was because William Penn wanted to create a settlement with the principle of religious toleration, specifically for a group of individuals who are known as the Quakers, the Pennsylvania Dutch, so on and so forth. Pennsylvania would be instrumental early on in being anti-slavery and pro-religious toleration, which we'll talk about again in future. Delaware gets established as well, kind of not. In fact, Delaware as a colony is a matter of dispute all the way up to And almost through the Revolution, there's a question as to just how independent Delaware is from Pennsylvania. They maintain their own colonial legislature, but just how independent they are depends on who you talk to. And in fact, the Delaware River remains disputed just about as long. Maryland is another one of those God colonies. It's founded by Lord Baltimore with the idea that it was going to be a refuge for English Catholics. Turns out not to be. The vast majority of the new settlers are Protestant, but still in 1649, they passed the first act of religious toleration in the New World. Some big takeaways for the Mid-Atlantic states. Mid-Atlantic states have the best farmland for your staple crops, talking wheat, corn, barley, so on and so forth. They also have the best rivers, the Hudson and the Delaware, which allow them to create the most important ports outside of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. They're also key when it comes to the concept of mercantilism. Mercantilism is essential for understanding any of the early colonial projects. So the idea behind mercantilism is tied in with the concept that's called balance of trade. Balance of trade, which was the prevailing economic policy of the 17th century, held that you had to have more exports than you had imports. And as long as you had more exports, then your economy was functioning well. It's an incredibly simplistic view that is not utilized today and certainly doesn't make any sense in our information-based technology. But back then, it's what people believed. Colonies fit into this because of the idea that the colony provided the mother country with two things. One was a guaranteed export-import. Most of the time, there were rules in place that required the colonies to trade with the mother country. Because of that, the mother country was guaranteed a certain percentage of exports and imports. It could essentially force the colonies to buy the goods that they didn't necessarily even want to buy. So that ups your export to import ratio. The other idea behind it was that the colonies would provide the mother country with raw materials. So you want to think things like timber, iron ore, sugar, other things that they cannot produce in places anymore like England and France, which is essentially devoid of trees at this point, and things that they cannot get otherwise. So the Mid-Atlantic functions as sort of the Goldilocks. It's not too hot, it's not too cold, as we're about to see with New England and the South. And the Mid-Atlantic proves to be probably also the least English of any of the English colonies because of the religious toleration in places like Maryland and Pennsylvania. You get a lot of French Protestants, Huguenots, who wind up in those territories. A lot of Germans, a lot of Dutch because of the influence and so on and so forth. So that makes these colonies a little bit more multicultural than we might expect otherwise, which makes them unique and interesting.